One more activity. Oh yes, a warning that we're recording the
Yeah.
talk today.
Fair
So
enough.
behave, everyone. Yes. Thank you. So this is one more activity of the Brazil IPS network. So the Brazil IPS network is, well, a network, as you know, that gathers researchers, students, um, young faculty and old faculty like myself and Beto, and who are interested in the and research inspired by international political sociology. Um, so the network has been in place since 2019, and we have a set of different activities. I'm not going to talk too much about that right now, but one of which are these conferences with distinguished scholars such as Jens Barthelson, who is with us today. Usually we do one of these conferences each semester. So we're very happy that Jens has accepted to give this conference in the second semester, closing the year. We're already in December, so I think it's a nice closure of this year's activities of the Brazil IPS network. The Brazil IPS network is, of course, open to anyone who's interested, so it's not, anything closed or anything like that. Just write to us, and we'll include you in our mailing list, and you can also take part in the activities of the network. So very well, today we have as our distinguished guest to give the conference, Professor Jens Barthelson. Jens is the professor of political science or international relations in the University of Lund in Sweden. He was previously, I believe, in the University of Copenhagen, but that was a while ago. But he's been in Lund for some time. Jens was also a guest faculty here in Rio de Janeiro some years ago. Many of the students here at PUC Rio were his students. And he also has been a collaborator of the journal IPS since a long time, since its inception, actually, and has published extensively in the journal and elsewhere. He also has contributed to the doctoral workshops and the winter school in the past. So Jens has a really long history of being part of the intellectual project of international political sociology. And we're very happy that he's back with us in this discussion. And a lot of his books and articles have inspired a great deal of work in international political sociology, continue to inspire us to discuss several different questions, from his very well-known book on the genealogy of sovereignty to his book on the critique of the state. Also his book called Visions of World Community, which I believe part of which was written here in Rio. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jens. And more recently, his book on war in international thought was a very important and influential book in the field. And happily, we have this book that just came out, Becoming International, that came out last month or October, right? I guess, yes, in October, where Jens picks up on, several different topics that he's been discussing in the past decades, I guess, right? We can see many themes present in this book that have been part of his discussions, since the early decades of the century. And I remember one of his main contributions at the beginning of the journal was a discussion about globality, for instance, and global civil society and globalization. So all these discussions about the relationship between the international and the global have been a key contribution of Jens' international political thought, not for the discipline and, well, of course, for IPS as well. So I guess this is a very fitting discussion for the state of this field, I guess, the subfield of IPS. Since we are once again, trying to discuss the concept of international, whether it has any relevance, if it has any future as a critical perspective on what goes on in the world, or if we have to replace international for some other concepts. And I was very happy reading Jens' book to see that he engages with this discussion outright. But I'll let him speak. I'm not going to say what Jens is saying in his book, but we have surely many questions about the book that come up that are very contemporary in the discussions we've been having here in IPS, among others. So Jens, thank you very much once again. We'll work the following way. We'll give the floor to Jens for between 30 and 40 minutes, I guess, for his initial talk, and then we will open for questions from the public. And the questions can be either made orally, if you feel comfortable speaking in English, but you can also write them down through the chat. So I'm going to enable the chat for everyone. And if you feel that's easier for any one of you to write in Portuguese, you're free to write the chat in Portuguese or any other language, and we'll translate it to Jens. So that makes it more democratic. Everyone can participate, and they're not forced to necessarily express themselves in English. Is that okay? Yes? Okay, guys, thanks very much. And I give the floor to Jens. Thank you very much. Yes, I'll let you know 3 minutes before 40 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Above all, thanks, João, for inviting me. Great pleasure. Even though I would prefer to be there in person, considering the temperature and the overall ambience of Rio de Janeiro. Great many faces, which I recognize from way back from my days in Rio de Janeiro. So I'm very happy to do this. I'm going to proceed in the following way. I'm going to present the outline of my book, the main argument, basically, cut to the bones. Then I'll say a few words why I believe that this is worthwhile and even important. And then, if there is any time left, about how, in terms of methodological choices, I ended up writing the kind of book that I actually wrote. First of all, however, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that how it all began. You know, books, they're always the finished product. It's always a result of much sandpaper and much putty, and it's very much a cover-up operation, because no book in this world really starts the way it ends. And this book is no exception. The project, when I conceived it some 6-7 years back, was that I still believed at that point in time that the rise of the international system was coeval with the transition from a world of empires to a world of states. So I started this project in order to locate, or in the hope of locating, the point in time when this transition took place, expecting that an answer would help me pinpoint the origin of the modern international system in a way different from extant accounts. That is, the initial ambition was to come up with yet another story of the origin of the international system. And this ended up being a search for the Holy Grail. It ended up being terribly frustrating, because however much I looked, I failed to detect any such a point of emergence or origin, since none of my sources, all the way from the 16th century to the present day, or let's say the late 19th century, they distinguish sharply between empires and states, let alone place them in historical succession. So nobody, it seemed, in the past had subscribed to the notion that there was anything international. The international seemed to be something that emerged first during the late 20th century in the sort of the fallout of decolonization or something. So I had to return to the drawing board and rephrase my initial question. And when I rephrased my initial question, things became clear. And I'll start now summarizing the argument of the book, not to assume that you have read it, just to give you some sort of a very brief outline of the main argument. If we start with the standard stories of the origin of the international system, we know quite well those stories, and we know also the kind of objections directed against those stories. We know about 1648, about Westphalia and the objections to that point of view. We know about the obvious alternative, 1815, that is the end of the Napoleonic Wars and then Vienna settlement in Europe, that would have marked the start of a recognizably modern international system. We know that many of those who disputed that date instead argued that 1919, the end of the First World War, and the Versailles Conference marked a benchmark date of the emergence of the international system. We also know that those who didn't like 1919 tended to be in favor of 1955 and the Bandung Conference as the point in time when a recognizably and genuinely global international system first emerged. Be that as it may, regardless of those attempts to pinpoint the origin of the modern international system, they all share the assumption that whenever this happened, the international system arose out of a world of empires, either in Europe or in the rest of the world, and those empires were thereby consigned to a pre-modern past. So if you scratch on all those accounts a bit, you will notice how periodization and social ontology have been made to reinforce each other in the study of modern international relations, so that modernity becomes coeval with the idea of an international system, and that system is supposedly composed of states, and everything that cannot really be assimilated to the state form, whether empires, tribes, city-states, or whatever, it's relegated to a pre-modern or even a feudal past. And so how to possibly tell the story of the emergence of the international system, given those obvious difficulties and those constraints? Because you don't want to repeat the same mistake. You don't want to come up with a story that launches a different point of origin, because what is wrong with all those stories isn't the benchmark date. It's to my mind, it's the idea of a transition between empires to states, because according to my sources, none of this never really happened in theory or in practice. So my story is instead focused on how the international realm, and I'm sort of deliberately vague here when I speak of an international realm, because I don't want to commit myself to whether this international realm is a system, a society, or a community. I simply lump all those descriptors together under the same heading as a real, simply put. So my focus is how this international real was conceptualized into existence and how this notion has been globalized. If you want, how the social fact of internationality emerged, became taken for granted, was disseminated across the world, and eventually internalized, so that everyone happened to come to the conclusion that, well, the world we inhabit is an international world by virtue of being a modern world of nation states. How did this system of belief emerge, and how did it travel across the planet? So that's the kind of problem I'm dealing with. That is not a problem of IR, properly speaking, but rather a problem in intellectual history, and more specifically, a problem of global intellectual history, because this isn't a story of Europeans coming up with all sorts of stupid ideas that other people are forced to subscribe to and take on board. It's a much more complicated process of dissemination, to which I will return in a while. Doing this, having this ambition, made me realize also that I couldn't really stay with all the canonical writers. I couldn't remain content with sort of the ivory tower. I couldn't remain content with rereading Grotius, rereading all the classics. I had to dig into other sources of a different kind, sources much closer to practice, and perhaps most importantly, sources, non-European sources, what they had to say about this process, at least about this process in later stages. There is an obvious delimitation of what I've been able to achieve. So I have focused on how a wide array of authors have tried to make sense of relations between polities. That is, not only between states, but between states, empires, tribes, churches, peoples, nations, all kinds of entities, from the onset of European expansion in the 16th century to the very bitter end of decolonization in the late 20th century. And doing this, since almost none of those authors, at least in the distant past, used the concept or distinguished between empires and states or other political or other polities, my response has been to historicize the meaning of those concepts in the process. That is, being contextually sensitive to how authors use those concepts when they try to make sense of relations between different polities. How did they describe those polities? How did they classify those polities? And how were those classifications themselves justified and incorporated in wider political and legal frameworks? My starting point here, when it comes to the historical part of the argument, is, and I guess João must be familiar with the starting point, because I'm a little bit recycling the paper I published, well, some 50 years ago in International Political Sociology about the social construction of globality. The starting point is that, well, it was the opening of a planetary space by the geographical and cartographical revolutions in the 16th century, and the resulting rivalry among European powers for universal sovereignty over that space. That was the starting point for internationality, if you want. Of course, it would be anachronistic to describe those discussions at this point in time as in terms of international relations or international politics or anything of the sort. But nevertheless, there was a very rich and sophisticated vocabulary available already during the 16th century for describing what Lauren Benton, I think, aptly has termed interpolity relations. And those interpolity relations and those discussions of interpolity relations, they are very much focused on the fallout of this competition for universal sovereignty, both in Europe in the shape of universal monarchy and in the non-European world in the shape of a dominus mundi in Latin, the overlordship of the entire world. And of course, those discussions, they hark back to Roman ideas of imperium and Renaissance appropriations of those discussions of imperium. This is what keeps proto-theorists of IR busy during the 16th century, not empires, not states, but the quest for universal sovereignty, both in Europe and in the newly discovered non-European world, especially the new transatlantic world. And from those discussions follow an ambition to bridle and delimit this quest for universal sovereignty, because it disturbs commerce, it disturbs the peace, it has all sorts of undesirable consequences for order, both in Europe and outside of Europe. And you know the standard recipes, because the standard recipes, how to bridle that quest, they are well known in extant studies, extant accounts of the history of political thought. It's public international law, the balance of power, diplomacy, and so forth. And when that kind of discussion starts to emerge towards the early 18th century, we can indeed justifiably speak of something akin to international relations in Europe. But the important part here, I think, of my story is that the outside, the non-European outside, it didn't really sort of occur or emerge spontaneously. It was carefully crafted into existence by the very same authors that came up with a recognizably modern idea of something international, of an international system in Europe. So the world was, by the sort of mid-18th century, was divided into a European inside of sovereign states and a non-European outside composed of empires. Some of those empires were, of course, old gunpowder empires of the East, but the predominant object of discussion at this point in time were colonial empires, emergent colonial empires. So the world was bifurcated here into two parts. One European part, characterized by distinct forms of rule and standard of legitimacy, and another part of the world characterized by other standards of legitimacy and rule. And if you dig into the relationship between those parts of the world, I think it's very obvious that the non-European outside is constitutive and is perceived to be constitutive of the world of sovereign, the European world of sovereign states, that only is possible to think of and conceptualize in contrast and contradistinction to the non-European world of empires. Not in terms, we have been accustomed to think of this relationship in terms of distinctions between Christians and non-Christians, or between civilized and uncivilized. This, in terms of social ontology, is not what matters. What matters is that the division of the world is according to principles of legitimacy and rule more than anything else. I would say that standards of civilization, which emerge later, and discourses of religious difference, which of course are present already in the 16th century, but then gradually fades. They are auxiliary justifications of this, not central parts of this argument. Then moving on to the spread of the international system, but because eventually, as we all know, this system spread to the rest of the world. And extant accounts of this spread have been focused on either on imposition, that is, that the Europeans somehow violently imposed this system, or if you want, the components of that system, the territorial state and eventually the nation state, upon the non-European world and its diverse populations. Or if it wasn't an imposition, a straightforward violent imposition, it was nevertheless, according to those standard accounts, a matter of a diffusion of Western concepts, of, for example, of state and nation and sovereignty and territoriality to the rest of the world. And of course, the imposition and diffusion is a matter of degree. Imposition is a gunpoint thing, whereas diffusion is more vague, that you nudge the Ottomans, or you nudge the Japanese, or you nudge the Cambodians to become something they weren't in the first place, not necessarily at gunpoint, but through diplomatic measures, through sanctions, through processes, or enforced processes of modernization, whatever you want. This, I contend, whether it's an old-fashioned liberal view of diffusion and imposition, or a post-colonial view, that is a negative view of the same processes, is not a valid view, whether in its liberal mode or in its post-colonial mode. To my mind, the spread of the international system and its component parts was rather a matter of creative appropriation. And here I'm following and I'm very much inspired by Arnulf Becker-Lorca's work in international law, and especially his book, Mestizo International Law. Because this creative appropriation, that you actually take on board Western concepts, not because you want necessarily fit into some stupid Western world order, but you realize that if you take on board those concepts of state, nation, sovereignty, territoriality, self-determination, independence, whatever that happens to be on your shopping list, though that can be twisted and become useful for your own distinctive ideological political ends in your own non-European polities, whether these are Latin American polities in the 1820s or African and Asian polities in the 1950s and 60s. So I very much wanted to trace the dissemination of those concepts that you could claim be constitutive of the modern international system through a global intellectual history, showing how they were appropriated, twisted, and how their meanings, of course, changed in the process of being appropriated. And what you discovered then is that, well, you could suspect that the story you would tell would be a very cynical story insofar that, well, you take on board those Western concepts basically to beat your opponents up at home and basically to squeeze as much cash out of your subject population as possible, basically to turn yourself into a dictator, basically to do all sorts of nasty things. Of course, those nasty things took place in many instances, but across the 19th century and across the 20th century, you also see a dominant tendency that those who took on board and appropriated those Western concepts did so not necessarily or primarily for any cynical ends of self-interested ends, but rather because they wanted to reform the international system in a more egalitarian direction. And this is, of course, a point that Adam Getachew has already made. I'm trying to universalize that point a bit by pointing to that this tendency was much more widespread in time and space than transatlantic Black political thought in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That this tendency, and I think this is something that also is corroborated by Arnulf Becker-Lorca's findings, how international law, of the attempts of Latin American lawyers to, after decolonization, to transform international law in directions more favorable to newborn states in the Americas. You could expect that this story should end on a happy note, that I should say, well, the modern international system, it didn't originate in 1648, it didn't originate in 1815, not in 1919, let alone in 1955. It originated in 1979 with the publication of Kenneth Walt's theory of international politics. Because then it's that's perhaps the first instance when you find a conception of the international, where the international is supposedly something more than the sum of its parts, and all those parts are states, and all those states are shaped into the same form by the impersonal forces of anarchy, and that would be the end station. No. Not really. There is no happy ending here, because if empires and states never really were distinct in the first place, and outside of 20th century nationalists' imaginaries, then this talk of something international doesn't make sense. What you do see, however, which I try to argue with some historical detail in my book, is that what we have been led to believe is the international is a continuation of imperial relations with other means. And what happens after decolonization isn't a liberation of the world from imperial domination or imperial oppression, or perhaps the rise of neocolonialism in economic terms. What happens is something more akin to what happens in comic strips, that when the international system finally is globalized, a trap door closes, because then there is no constitutive outside left. And if there is no constitutive outside of empires and statelessness left, the international system takes on the very same qualities as ancient empires once had, in a way, embodied. And of course, this is not a substantial empirical claim. This is a play in the history of ideas. I do argue that it's possible to interpret the modern international system as an empire in its own right, because once it was globalized, the qualities of empire, but its decentralized authority structure, its multicultural character, the embodiment of tolerance in the UN Charter. All of this corresponds to what would have been to Dante and Gattinara and all those medieval and early modern theorists of empire. This was their absolute wet dream of having a universal political system covering all of humanity and all known territorial space on the planet. And of course, the obvious question, but there is no emperor there to govern this stupid empire. Well, and then my cop-out is, of course, very cynical, but I think is, if you dig into both ancient and modern sources, possible to substantiate, because you don't need an emperor if you have internet, or if you have people subscribing to the idea that the world is characterized, or the international real is characterized by anarchy, because then humankind is divided and compartmentalized into distinct polities, characterized by mutual suspicion and stuck in security dilemmas. So the divide et impera function that once upon a time was credited with the emperor is fulfilled spontaneously and automatically by an invisible hand, not very unlike the invisible hand regulating modern capitalism, if you want. So that's the outline of the argument, and it's sort of very much deliberately designed to disturb everyone from the diehard liberals to post-colonial scholars to Marxists. It's intended to provoke everyone, not because I'm convinced that I'm right in any way, but rather because I think it's in a way necessary to rethink those relations in the present. I don't know whether I have time to state why I think this is important. How many minutes do I have left, Joao?
You still have 15 minutes.
Oh, good. Because why do you embark on such a crazy project? Because it was a crazy project. Luckily the pandemic came, and I was confined to my home office for over a year, and I couldn't go anywhere. My local bar was open, but that was about it. So I could take long walks, I could write my book, and I could frequent my local bar. It's shut down by 8 o'clock at night. So I was guaranteed a modicum of sobriety during this entire year. And hence I chipped away on the book and dug into all sorts of weird sources from all sorts of weird contexts. So, but why? Why is this interesting in the first place? I think one reason that came up instantly, and which was in the back of my head when I embarked on the project, was this ongoing discussion in IR whether international politics is best characterized in anarchical or hierarchical terms. And most scholars want to have it both ways. The ground has shifted insofar that you have very few people believing that anarchy, the logic of anarchy, somehow is exhaustive of international politics. And you have quite a few people believing that any such account needs to be supplemented with an account of how and why hierarchical, or if you want, imperial relations have been able to endure and structure international political reality for a long time, despite all sorts of ideas of sovereign equality and things like that. So, and also the growing consensus among historians of political thought and historians of empire that the modern international system, its rise has been premised on a hierarchical relationship between the Western world and the rest. What does those two contentions, what do they imply for the way we conceive of the history of the modern international system and its emergence? Because those two contentions taken together have been instrumental in those objections against the standard benchmark dates. So that was an important rationale. Basically, if we want to set our social ontology straight, we need to set our historical record straight, as well as conversely. Also, and this is very much a tribute to Rob Walker, one of Rob's dearest hobby horses has been to claim that the international is in itself a sui generis category. It cannot be reduced to sovereignty. It cannot be reduced to its component parts, states, nations, or whatever. The international, however you choose to define it, has an independent existence, which is very hard to grasp. And I thought I needed to rise to that challenge, because obviously when I started to consult my sources, there was talk of something international, even though the term wasn't used. And here is another, of course, another methodological trap that you don't want to step into, because on the one hand, as you all know, the term international was coined by Jeremy Bentham in the 1780s. And this would, of course, entail to speak of something international before that point in time would risk anachronism. You could easily be vulnerable to the accusation of anachronism. You have lots of people doing this, but they are not historians of political thought. You have lots of sociologists lots of people speaking of medieval international relations and so forth. I didn't want to fall into that trap. So still, it was obvious from my sources that people prior to the 1780s spoke of relations between polities of different kinds as if they obeyed a certain logic, which was distinct from the logic the logic of authority and the logic of sovereignty reigning unobstructed within those polities. The concept of empire is a case in point, because it seems to straddle those domains. It is neither domestic nor international. It is both, basically. And how do you handle that? So my solution to this problem was very much to focus on the becoming of the international system and not paying too much attention to what kind of polities people were reasoning about, still being adamant that this doesn't allow us to speak of something recognizably modern, international, but it does allow us to speak of interpolity relations, and it does allow us to raise interesting and important questions about the relationship between the interpolity world, so to speak, and the international world, so to speak. Third, I was driven, to my mind, and I think to many post-colonial scholars as well, we are not very happy with the international system. To my mind, as a diehard anarchist, I think the international system is a giant outdoor prison, which isn't very conducive to human flourishing, to use an Aristotelian expression. And still, we have some difficulties to imagine how the world could be otherwise. So I wanted to expose the historical contingency of the modern international system by demonstrating that its emergence wasn't characterized by any kind of necessity. I think the standard accounts, they tend to emphasize the necessity of its emergence. I wanted to emphasize the contingency of its emergence by showing how it could have looked otherwise had different roads been taken at critical junctures. That South Asia and West Africa should have ended up as nation states. It's a sheer coincidence. They could have ended up as federations equally well. And it's just sort of small historical accidents that pushed things in another direction, to my mind. So the nation state was but many alternatives on the table. So the task is to explain why those alternatives also fell wayside in the process of becoming international. Fourth, and I think you shouldn't overstate this because it plays very much into contemporary political concerns. But I think an important part of my argument has been to show the constitutive role of nationalism in the making and dissemination of the modern international system. Nationalism is not just a coincidence. Nationalism is not a matter of choice. Nationalism went straight into building the modern international system, regardless of where this happened. This goes for Sweden, this goes for France, but it goes for Nigeria, it goes for Algeria, it goes for India, it goes for Pakistan, it goes for everyone. That nationalism went for export and it was widely disseminated. And of course, a question of creative appropriation in the process. This goes some way to explain why nationalism is so readily reactivated today. Why all those politicians, when they feel that the cohesion of their respective states is threatened by global forces or other forces, of flows of people, of cash or information, their sort of default gut response is to go nationalist, despite nationalism being so widely discredited because of the obvious ills that it caused during much of the 20th century. The two world wars being, of course, the foremost among those ills. So this gut response and the global character of this gut response, it doesn't matter whether it's Maduro, it doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump, it doesn't matter whether it's Erdogan or Narendra Modi. Nationalism is there. Nationalism is there, ready to be reactivated whenever you feel that your position of power is crumbling or shaky. And I wanted to, this is not among the explicit, this is no explicit part of my research problem, but I sort of inadvertently stumbled upon the importance of nationalism. So I thought I'd better highlight it because it somehow helps us understand why you have those eruptions of nationalism again today. And it serves to warn us about the potentially nasty consequences also of this. So I think this was it. In terms of method, you can ask me questions, and I guess some of your questions will concern my methodological choices. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Jens. Thank you, thank you. Okay, we have now a little bit over an hour for questions and answers. So if you could please either raise your hand or write something in the chat. So first of all, we have Mariela.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Jens. I haven't read your book yet, but I was wondering, I have a few questions on methodology. The first one is, what kind of sources have you used? If you can get into some details on that. And if you have contemplated any non-textual practices. For what you say, I understand that you have used a lot of textual or texts, but if you have contemplated some non-textual practices. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mariela. Let's take a couple of more questions, Jens, before we go back to you. Manuela, please.
Hi, Jens. I have two questions. The first one is I'd like to go back to your confrontation to the claim that the diffusion of European values was violently imposed. So, I mean, I was wondering if you are eager to confront that claim. How do you interpret patterns of violence in your framing? For instance, in the encounters with entities claimed as culturally different. I know that you have a book about war, which is really important too. So, I mean, I would just, my first question is, could you please explore a little bit further where violence is placed in your framing, interpretative framing? And the second question is that you said in the beginning, perhaps is connected to Mariela's question also on methodology. You said in the beginning that you sought for writings of a practical kind as sources. I would like to hear a little bit more about that too, because my sense is that I was recalling the discussion that Foucault makes in Security, Territory, Population, when he discusses how police is diffused across different territories in a certain period of time in Europe, because understood as a response to practical dilemma of governmental practices. And I was wondering, in your practical writings of the practical kind that you resort in your study, if that kind of disposition to adopt not particularly a principle or a juridical form, but a response to a practical dilemma of governments that is seen as appropriate, and then becoming modern is a contingent result of that. I don't know if I made myself clear. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can get one more. Okay, so if no one is eager right now, I'll just tag into these more methodological questions also, and conceptual questions, and ask Jens about his claim, which I found very interesting, right? That the international, of course, it's thought into existence. So it's very much a conceptual history. So much of what the processes that go into the constitution of the international are, well, intellectual processes. You know, it's a history of ideas, if you like. So I guess that has to do with the questions about how do you deal with practices in a certain sense, so that you don't just do a history of ideas, right? You have to do a history of how the international emerges as a natural set of practices and strategies and other entities, if you like. But I was also interested in how you articulated the notion that the international is more than its parts, which is a familiar notion, of course, and that it governs itself as an empire without an emperor. So if you could say a bit more about it, because you say you don't need an emperor because there's anarchy. And it seems to me that you're dangerously close to walls, of course, right? Because if you don't need an emperor, structure does the work. So if it's not structure doing the work, I mean, if this whole that is bigger than its parts, right? And that has emerged along the different moments in history to different processes. If it's not structure, what is it? And if it's not structure, how do you actually transcend, right, the international? But the idea of transcendence, I'll leave for a different question. Sorry, Jens, that's a bit much. Thank you.
Should I answer, or should we extract more questions?
If I think you can go now. Yeah, you have plenty. You want more?
No, I'm happy with batches of tree. That sounds
Okay, good.
typical of perfect. Mariella, yes, indeed. When it comes to sources, I must confess that I haven't consulted non-textual sources, even though this would have been most interesting to do. Lots of artwork, lots of architecture, lots of movies, lots of archaeological artifacts. All of this have been potentially relevant, but it would have compelled me to do the thing I couldn't do, to travel. And that sounds like a poor excuse for the obvious fact that I am very much a textual guy. This doesn't mean that I don't consume other sources, but I tend to consume other sources for pleasure rather than out of obligation. So I'm not that skilled basically in making sense of non-textual stuff, but I realize the kind of excitement that especially having a look at the architectural sort of instantiations of internationality, if you want. That's an entirely new book. I'm not sure I'm the guy to write it. When it comes to sources in general, I think I wanted to become, and this is in partial response to Manuela's second question as well, I wanted to do several things. I wanted to display or demonstrate the extent that there was a continuum between theoretical deliberations and practical politics. Sometimes that was easy. When I discuss Italian unification, for example, I was so lucky that many of those guys who actually bringing it about on the ground were also writing tracts in its defense. Something similar goes for German unification, of course. And I was also lucky in some instances with guys like guys who fought for independence, guys like Simon Bolivar and guys like Amilcar Cabral. They were sort of composing essays nighttime and fighting daytime, or conversely. So there was sort of you could make, if not easy inferences, so they themselves assumed that there was a continuity what they did at their desk and on the battlefield. And that, of course, opened the possibility, in partial response to Joao's first question about how you conceive of intellectual history in relation to political practice. We are all, at least us who have been bred into a post-structuralist, contextualist tradition, we have all been in the habit of assuming that this is a matter of trickling down, that ideas trickle down and are translated into institutions and practices. We tend to be in profound disagreement exactly of how this happens, depending on whether we're conceptual historians or contextualist historians, or Foucauldian genealogists, or a mixture of all of the above. We tend to disagree how this happens, but we tend to assume that this is the way things happen. They start at the conceptual level. It starts with the pen and ends with the sword, so to speak. So what you do at your desk in the morning is likely to determine what you do at night on the battlefield, rather than conversely. In this book, I have abandoned this model, basically, more or less, and instead been interested in studying the interplay, how what you do on the battlefield condition the meaning of the concept that you write highbrow things about at night. And of course, the guys who were in the business of justifying Italian unification, they demonstrate this adamantly well. What they achieved in a meeting with Cavour in the afternoon went right into their writing, their lecture in Torino the next morning, and so forth. And what Simon Bolivar didn't achieve in Caracas in 1809 went into what he wrote in Cartagena 4 years later, and so forth. And what Amilcar Cabral did achieve in Cabo Verde, of course, made an imprint on his conceptualization of independence in his speeches in Accra the year after, and so forth. So I've been very much adamant that I wanted to do this, to link pen and sword together. And of course, I haven't succeeded across the board, but on a few instances, I think I've been lucky when I had the benefit of reading sources, guys who were not stuck in the ivory tower, but who were fighting their way to realize their ideals. And this is, of course, nothing that I've invented all by myself. I think a great source of inspiration here has been the American historian Jeremy Edelman, who I think has done so brilliantly with reference to Latin American history. And if you want to formalize this a bit in theoretical terms, I think a way of making sense of this is to study how concepts become weaponized, and how the weaponization of concepts, whether it's nationhood, sovereignty, or recognition, or whatever concept you want to weaponize, that this weaponization of concepts tend to follow the fault lines of the underlying political conflicts, so that you struggle to invest a given concept with a given meaning just in order to forward your political case, that you're forwarding through parliamentary speeches, or you're forwarding with the use of violence on the battlefield. I think guys like Thomas Jefferson, guys like Thomas Paine, guys like Andres Bello, you have lots of those guys who actually were shaping the modern international system and had first-hand experience of this shaping. They were in the business of weaponizing concepts. And the process of weaponization is in itself a worthwhile object of inquiry, I would say. Manuela raised the question of violence and imposition. And of course, all those processes I describe in this book most of them were extremely violent. The process of becoming international was an extremely violent process in Europe as well as elsewhere. In the aftermath of the First World War, for example, in Europe, when the principle of nationality was hammered home as the gold standard of political legitimacy, that went hand in hand with a massive onslaught of minorities. And the same pattern repeated itself when the principle of nationality went for export later in the same century. And all those processes were extremely violent. I have downplayed the role of violence in this book, not because it didn't matter, but rather because it didn't make as much difference to the final makeup of the world. It caused lots of bloodshed, but if you want to understand the mechanisms, how, for example, India became a nation state rather than a village federation. I'm here obviously referring to Shruti Kapila's work on the violent fraternity, how to understand why India ended up as a nation state rather than anything else. It was given what had transpired from the early 20th century until the very point of independence in 1947, you would suspect that violence should be constitutive of the final outcome. And all those who actually promoted the use of political violence on the Indian subcontinent at that point in time, they were strongly disinclined to have a nation state. They wanted all sorts of different things. But the last thing they wanted was a nation state, or two nation states, because you got a Pakistani one in the process as well. Yet, nevertheless, you ended up with this nation state. So the trick case is that while violence, both of European origin, so to speak, or of domestic origin, were very much prevalent in the process of decolonization, and even, of course, before that, I wouldn't as easily plug into the idea that violence has been constitutive of the international order. I took a shot at this argument in my book on war in international thought, that showing how this was a very widespread assumption, and has been a very widespread assumption, that the international system was originated and shaped to violence, and therefore that particular violence was constitutive. My sources indicate differently, that the process, although it was followed and sometimes driven by violence, the processes of creative appropriation were much more multifaceted than we are led to believe by those accounts that emphasize collective and individual violence. So hence my willingness to downplay the role of violence. I think I've given João some kind of answer to how I conceive of the relationship between intellectual history and political practice, that it's a two-way street rather than a one-way street. The international empire and the importance of structure was João's second question. And of course, I am not tempted to subscribe to Wald's own version that there is some kind of structure there in the background which produces functionally equivalent results. I'm more inclined to believe that it's the social fact of an anarchy, that is the collective belief of anarchy. I'm ultimately a sort of constructivist in that regard. It's the social fact and the collective conviction, as it's the sort of ultimately, I would maintain that what keeps capitalism alive and well is the ultimate convictions and institutionalizations about the meaning of money and markets and the like. So if everyone in some sort of science fiction counterfactual experiment all of a sudden would forget about anarchy and wake up one morning and don't understand the meaning of international anarchy, we wouldn't necessarily be better off, but the emperor would be gone. So the emperor is within each and every, it's not part of any sort of immutable external structure, but the emperor is something we carry on our back in our everyday lives in that regard, especially by reading too much IR literature. So much for my anarchism. So I think I've been reasonably exhaustive when answering your questions. So I'm ready for a batch of 3 more, if you like.
Thanks very much, Jens. We already have Victor and Joanna in line. So Victor, you go first, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm sharing
Yes.
a room here, so I'm not speaking very loud. So thanks, Jens, for the conference and for the book. It was an amazing reading. I just have perhaps 2 questions, short ones, but I would like to share 4 reactions. The first one would be similar to João's point, which would be, it seems that the lack of emperor is just the apex of a certain historical trajectory. But I would say that it makes a whole difference, actually. So it seems that the book tries to evade periodization in terms of the empire and the international. But then for that, ultimately, the lack of emperor, which for me is a very important characteristic, is ultimately just the end point of a trajectory of the expansion of the international. So I don't know if I read this correctly, but I was trying to think of how that fits, for instance, with Nikonnov's notion of heteronomy to discuss the international. So the second, I was a bit shocked, perhaps. I don't know if shocked is a good term, but disturbed, I would say, when at some point you say that the universalization of the international makes the outside gone. The outside was gone. But I think, I don't know if you hear me because the connection seems not stable, but when I read that the international was gone, I was a bit disturbed because it seems a very materialist geographical notion of the outside. While in a certain way, the international that works as an imperial by other means is constantly producing its outside. So I understand that the outside is gone because the nation state is universalized, but then it's not exactly gone in another sense, right? So can you explain a little bit more if it is really a materialist geographical notion of the outside, or if you take the outside in a different way as well, for instance, as principles of legitimation of the imperial, of the international common period. Third reaction, I try to take a second reading of some parts of the book, replacing the imperial by colonial. And I was really stuck with the argument because for me, I read the book as the international colonial and not exactly imperial. Because why the choice of imperial and not colonial? Because in many senses, for instance, when you say that in West Africa or even in Brazil, things could have been different, I take that things were not different because of colonial relations. So perhaps the concept of the colony here is a formal colony, and the imperial gets a lot of space. But I would be tempted to read your book as saying that the international works as a colonial form of rule, perhaps. Second to last, if I may just share 2 other quick things. Also, the choice of the centrality of nationalism, which comes from previous books, for instance, Issues of World Community. And I was also thinking if this centralization of nationalization of community that the visions in this book reinforce is not playing a certain to make this in a very straightforward question, is the center of gravity of your argument nationalism? So if this is the center of gravity of your argument, then it seems that what comes before and what comes after, in terms of your international intellectual, of your global intellectual history, is gravitating around nationalism. And I know that you are not saying, I know that you are saying that the Eurocentric concept is the Europeans thinking themselves as Eurocentric, but then when nationalism becomes the center of gravity, isn't this an Eurocentric reading of the becoming international? And so finally, on the last part of the book, when you talked about the planetary, at some point you say that the discussion of planetary is a reversal of the distinctions between nature and culture, for instance, or nature and culture. But then I was thinking that much of the discussion on the planetary today is not exactly proposing a reversal, but an insistence on the relationality between humans and non-humans. And it's not that the planetary is the base and the international is the grid of power, but it's a whole different conception of the relation between humans and non-humans in terms of really a relationality, which is present, in my view, in Chakrabarty's distinction of a geological time and a historical time. So I'm just suggesting that the part of the planetary literature is not reversing, but conceiving differently the relation between the humans and non-humans in terms of relationality. So yeah, I try to be very fast. Thank you, Jens.
Thank you, Victor. There is a string of questions there, Jens, for you. I'll give you some time to digest, but I'll have Joanna and Gaio before. Is that okay, Jens?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, Joanna, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I can go after Victor after that, if you're going to remember all the questions. But I just wanted to, something called my attention in your presentation, and it was when you talked about historical accidents, right? It wasn't but historical accidents that turned the world into certain ways or certain places, certain ways. So I just wanted to, and yeah, just bear in mind, because it was 6 a.m. here when this started, so I might be a little incoherent. But when you talk about historical accidents, it has certain implications, right? For the way people one can talk about agency or action in history, and therefore there are consequences for things like violence in history. And I think it's related to what Victor was concerned with in relation to the imperial and the colonial, and what kind of consequences that has for when we talk about the imperial and or the colonial. But it also, I think it has political implications for how one, I'm guessing your personal politics, right? You're trying to challenge the political imagination and how it gets straitjacked by the way we tell the story or we look at history, right? So, and there's implications for whether one can see that there is no emperor, or that one can stop believing in capitalism, or one can stop believing that the world is the way it's supposed to be because we read too much IR. And so how does that, yeah, I just curious about how you think about the implications of this approach to history and the political implications that you're trying to bring with it as well. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Joanna. Gaio, please. And then we have Beto, and then we close this round with Beto. Is that okay? Yeah.
Okay. First, I would like to thank for this lecture. It has been really fascinating. And my question is that I would like to know, how do you identify this view of nationalism as a main cause for the imperial aspects of the modern state through the current conflict between Israel and Palestine? and mostly on the affirmation of the Israeli state against the claim of a legitimate non-European modern state for the Palestinian people. And after that, I would also like to know, how would you see a possible solution for the conflict, or path for a solution at least, outside the nationalistic realm of the current imperial system? That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gaio. Beto.
Can you guys hear me well? Okay. Jens, thank you so much. This is wonderful. Unfortunately, I didn't read the whole book yet, just the beginning, but I'm very, very excited, and thank you so much. First of all, out of curiosity and pure self-interest, I would love to hear more about, this, I wouldn't say turn, but, this engagement with certain literature in international law. In international law, there has been, this turn to history a couple of years ago, led by many people such as Marty Koskaniemi and Alford and many others, actually many of whom with whom you engaged in book. So I was wondering your commentaries on this work on history of international law. You referred to Arnold Becker-Locker, to Marty, and many others. I was wondering if you have anything to share about this, which I read as a very different kind of a rapprochement or interdisciplinary engagement between international law and relations, very different than the more conventional one. But two main questions that I wanted to share with you, or points that I wanted maybe to put on the table, so you can share something with us. I was wondering, considering the time frame and how you re-engage with Salamanca School, Victoria, and many others, but most especially with the discussion of empire and the transition thesis. How and do you engage, or if you don't think it's important, and if you don't think it's important, why, with the issue of political theology? I'm here thinking about certain rereadings of the history of international law, for instance, about Victoria, where some people would say that there you have this complex arrangement where ius gentium, involves ius inter gentes. So there's a complexity there, but there's also the foundation of authority in relation to deity, right? And through the centuries, then the disappearance of ius gentium and the disappearance of the deity as a ultimate grounding of international law is a kind of a mystery of the foundations of this international authority. So I was wondering, how do you engage or not, and if you think it's relevant or not, with the issue of political theology in this broader context? So this is the first one. The second one, and if I understood correctly, your response to Manu about the weaponization of concepts, I was wondering how you would react, or your commentaries, with a certain broader, if I could put this way, broader politics of language, if we associate signifiers, concepts, category with, of course, the systems within which they are created, make sense, and acquire meaning, and can be weaponized. So I was wondering if this more macrological politics of language, and here, just to share a thought, I'm thinking in certain correlated commentaries, both from Deepesh Chakrabarti, but also Kathleen Daves, when in the beginning of her work on sovereignty and periodization, she says something that what is involved in that kind of problematization is also a certain global application or globalization of political forms or political concepts, if you will. So I was wondering how you would correlate the weaponization of concept with this broader politics of language, if it makes sense or not. Thanks, Jens. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Starting with Victor, thank you for very interesting comments, and some of them some of your questions I don't think I have very good answers to, at least not straightforward answers. So I will will have to ponder them carefully. What I can provide is a tentative shot at answers. Yes, of course, the story I tell about the end point, or where my story ends, about the globalization of the international system and the ironic twist I give to this story, that it ends up as an empire, and there is a certain lack of emperor. So in that regard, in that empirical regard, the story is unwarranted. It's sort of very much an interpretation. I was hesitant whether to include this in the book, and I decided eventually not to include it, because there is a passage in Dante which many people have remarked on. I think I made a remark on that passage in my Visions of World Community, where Dante sees as the proper sort of end station of empire, that humanity becomes an emperor. And he is then faced with the question, but then if humanity as such, humanitas is the term he uses in Latin, if humanitas as such is an emperor, why should it ever think of keeping itself divided? And this is a comment which has been subject to different translations and different disputes for a long time, as Kantorowicz made a very famous set of comments on that problem. So frankly, I don't believe in empirical terms that the international is an empire in its own right. But if you do exactly, and now we approach the problem of periodization again head on. If the problem of periodization comes with an injunction against anachronism, that doesn't mean that we are not free to turn the tables on periodization by saying things like that things that we believe are modern are profoundly medieval. Actually, Constantin Fassault encourages us to do exactly that in his conclusion to the limits of history, that accusing somebody for behaving in the medieval way or doing something medieval today is, in his way, according to his view, a much more permissive intellectual move than policing anachronism with the aim of recovering history as it really was. So I'm trying to play that trick on the tendency to periodize the international system into existence by saying something to the effect that it's, well, what you think is the culmination of modernity is basically profoundly medieval. And I didn't do this explicitly, but it's an ironical twist more than anything else. You're perfect in this, that the universalization of the international system means that the outside is gone. whether this means that the outside is gone. This was exactly what David Armitage asked me when he read the first draft of the manuscript. And he directed me to Deepesh Chakraborty to, the geographical outside might be gone, but you do have the planetary here and the non-human there, which now re-enters or is re-inscribed as yet another constitutive outside. And I was struggling to take this on board. There is no coincidence that this is where the book ends, because I was really struggling to take on board that kind of argument. And whether the planetary, however conceived, is a saving grace in that regard, that it duplicates an outside, and therefore is potentially liberating of the humans, the profound human entrapment in the planetary. I arrived at the conclusion that this depended on a reversal. I'm not 100% adamant that I'm right on that score, but that it presupposed a reversal of nature and culture, of the relationship between nature and culture, between the human and the non-human, if you want. But I'm not sure, and I haven't read enough to be, so thanks for pointing this out. Something similar goes for the colonial and the imperial in my account. I was struggling very much with whether to carry on a sustained discussion about the difference between imperialism and colonialism. This has been a mainstay in all the literature, the historical literature of imperialism and colonialism. Some people want to keep them apart. Some people are more inclined to see colonialism as a correlate or a consequence of imperialism, and so forth. And of course, when you ask this question, it is obvious that the international stands in a certain relationship to colonialism, which is less straightforward than its assumed relationship to imperialism, and that you can raise the question and then you get a much more complicated picture of the diffusion, of the dissemination of the international system if you take colonialism, and especially settler colonialism, into consideration. I think this is something that I will have reason to return to in coming works. But obviously, as you pointed out, something which I couldn't really conclusively deal with in this book. So it renders, the present book renders colonialism a little bit hostage to fortune in that regard. Whether nationalism constitutes the center of gravity in my account, and whether this amounts to a Eurocentric reading. Yes, I would say that it amounts to a Eurocentric reading, and for the simple reason that nationalism, as we know it, is of a Eurocentric, or is of a European origin. I just wanted to pinpoint the extent to which the nationalism, in the superficial sense of the imagined congruence of nations and states, how this rhetorical trope, or if you want, this ontological assumption, what has been traveling by virtue of being appropriated. I think my argument is in the book is there is one thing I leave out, and that's the subdued continuity between early modern forms of nationalism. That is, forms of nationalism that aren't premised on this congruence between nation and state, but which nevertheless take states to somehow contain or harbor relatively homogeneous populations. This is something that you find already in the 17th century. Basically an idea also of Roman origin, which continues to reverberate for the entire early modern period, but it never ever disseminates outside the European context. You get a few Creole shots in the same direction in the 1820s. But yes, it's a center of gravity, I would say, in my account, but for simple empirical reasons. And I think there has been, ironically, and this is something that I've written elsewhere about, the study of nationalism has long itself been victim to methodological nationalism. It has been confined to distinct polities. And I want to highlight the extent to which nationalism has been, for a long time, a systemic phenomenon, and a phenomenon which also has been constitutive of modern international order. And I think this is, I'm here in good company with Jacques Heiskanen and others who pursue that argument. But I think it's not perhaps that original, but I think it's necessary to point out the systemic and constitutive features of this coincidentally European phenomenon. So the planetary, I haven't really succeeded in coming to terms with the planetary at all. But my gut sense is that it's not as new as guys like Dipesh Chakraborty and Bruno Latour want us to believe. I think, unfortunately, it harks back to you can find traces of this in Heidegger, for example, and then with equally, and even if not more, unfortunate connotations, which are more or less explicitly nationalist in character. So I'm sort of very hesitant. I see the intellectual potential in invoking the planetary as a possible intellectual, as a way of emancipating ourselves from the strictures of the international and the failures of the global and so forth. But I'm still a little bit suspicious given the pedigree of that concept. Joanna asked me about historical accidents. And of course, historical accidents are difficult. Whenever I speak of a historical accident or a historical contingency, the burden of evidence automatically shifts in my disfavor, so to speak, because then I have to come up with some convincing counterfactual case. And since counterfactual cases never are convincing for obvious reasons that they cannot be falsified, there is no sort of sound basis for speaking about what happens in history in terms of what is accidental and what is necessary. Yet, nevertheless, I want to speak of what is accidental and contingent, simply because people in the past, my colleagues in the past, they have been to my mind, too prone and too eager to regard the coming into being of the modern international system as characterized by a certain degree of causal and perhaps even in some cases moral necessity. And I want to dispute that. And I want to, as an awareness raising campaign, if you want, a cosmopolitan awareness raising campaign, point out that, well, that is not really the case, that this was necessary. But of course, all nationalists and all people who have been clinging to power the past century or so, they have, for natural reasons, been inclined to make us believe that all of this is necessary, rather than just a blip on the screen. So that's so much for the political implications. The political implications are the usual political implications coming from me. One dose of cosmopolitanism, one dose of anarchism, and one dose of conservatism and shake the entire cocktail. The proportions, they tend to vary, but the cocktail, the ingredients, they tend to be the same. Sometimes I'm more cosmopolitan than conservative. Sometimes that I'm more of an anarchist than a conservative. But they do hang together, and that's my hidden agenda, so to speak. That's what I seek to promote. And Gaio, I'm of course not equipped intellectually and in terms of knowledge to provide any sort of insightful comments on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. My colleagues, I have several colleagues in the department who are busy 24/7 commenting upon that question and have done extensive research for decades. But the question you raise, I think, is quite straightforward, and that's a question of nationalism in this context. And I wish nationalism somehow was, in a way, shaping this conflict, because then it would have been, if not easier to solve, so at least easier to comprehend. It would have been more straightforward. Yasser, I can feel nostalgic thinking of Yasser Arafat and Menachem Begin at this point in time, because the nationalism, I wouldn't say that nationalism, other than in some superficial sense, is the driver here any longer. I would say that religious sentiments and religious resentiments on both sides tend to be an important driver. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the nationalism lost its grip on the Mideast in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and was superseded by a host of other fault lines. But still, I mean, still there is this possibility of argue that Israeli nationalism has transmuted into some kind of socio-religious nationalism. This is an argument that you are perhaps in Brazil not entirely familiar with, having had the nasty experience of Jair Bolsonaro hijacking the evangelical church for his own purposes. So there is a tendency, which you see clearly in India as well, how nationalism and religious sentiment are being fused together into explosive cocktails. And I think that some parts of the current Israeli government could perhaps best be described in those terms. Last but not least, Beto, you raised a series of questions that are very dear to me and that I have some stakes in answering about the history of international law and its relationship to IR scholarship. As a coincidence, this morning, there was a draft article by Carsten Andreas Schulz arriving in my inbox, discussing exactly this, how the IR scholars had been responding to and taking on board insights from historical international law, or if you want, international legal history, because this has been a long-standing process of cross-fertilization for at least 15 or 20 years, as you point out rightly, starting with Marty. Marty has been around in Lund and Stockholm for decades, and there has been this cross-fertilization for a long time. As people have recently pointed out, they had a symposium 3 years ago in Cambridge with Marty and the brilliant Annabelle Brett and Megan Donaldson and lots of people on board. This has also been a source of considerable friction because historians of political thought and historians of international thought, especially, they don't really want to allow for what is so dear to international legal historians, namely that international law still retains a modicum of autonomy from international politics. They don't want to sacrifice, even though Marty, during his heydays, did sacrifice in The Gentle Civilizer, did sacrifice the autonomy of international law on the altar of power politics, so to speak. This is not what people want. And if you are familiar with the heated debate between Anne Orford and Lauren Benton, who have been discussing this extensively, I don't want to put my hands down in their cookie jar too much. I do, basically, without knowing what I'm doing, I do basically, I think, exactly what Annabelle Brett wants us to do if we are to split the difference between the histories of international thought and histories of international law, to take a broad, linguistically and genealogically oriented approach to these topics and their relationship, without committing ourselves to the autonomy of law, or let alone the autonomy of politics, or the primacy of politics, or the primacy of law, but rather instead, and I believe that this was a guiding principle when I wrote Becoming International, to study their interplay as carefully as possible. And I think a case in point is very much let's say, the evolution of the practices of international recognition. Those practices, they evolved from the late 18th century onwards, very much as a result of very much self-conscious cross-fertilization between international lawyers and politicians, to the point that you really couldn't tell them apart at some points. And I think in the chapter on independence and empire, I tried to make that in that close interdependence plane. And let's see what I'm trying to solicit Annabelle Brett to write a commentary on the book. Let's see what she has to say. She's the judge on those topics. And then you asked about and directly in connection with this, about the politics of language. Yes, of course. When you do this, when you have those ambitions to operate across contexts, socially, culturally, historically, you have to stay macro. What I study is vocabularies, political languages, legal languages, not so much as individual speech acts, even though I'm very fond of demonstrating that this or that speech act did make a difference. So when somebody delivered a speech in the British Parliament to the effect, or the Barings and the Goldsmiths advocated that the province of Rio de la Plata should be granted independence, that's of course an important speech act, which was instrumental in persuading George Canning ultimately to grant that independence. But they could only do this from benefiting and stating their point within a language that was already available and had been available in political economy since the onset, the beginning of the Scottish Enlightenment. That is, that colonialism is bad business, basically, and free trade is good business. And good free trade takes nominally sovereign states, even if they are informally provinces of the British Empire, as Venezuela eventually ended up being. So this is the point I want to enforce, that You study that the relationship between individual speech acts and political languages isn't mutually exclusive, but if you want to study both, you are saddled with the burden of demonstrating their interconnectedness, so to speak. So you don't have to pick sides with Quentin Skinner or John Pocock. You can squeeze them together happily, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating when it comes to the empirics. If you can make sense of the empirics, everything is kosher. Finally, last but not least, Kathleen Davis on the globalization of political, or the importance of periodization for the globalization of political concepts. Yes, of course, as she points out, that the periodization, she doesn't dwell too much on empire. She dwells mainly on feudalism and religion as markers of the medieval in its contradistinction from the modern. But if you want to generalize that point, of course, as she says, as she writes, that particular practice of periodization is perfectly coeval with European colonialism. It coincides in time, and it helps justify colonialism by saddling people, non-European peoples, with the same superstitions and bad habits and feudalisms and so forth, which this periodization had relegated to the past, so that the non-European outside becomes a stand-in for the non-modern past, as well as conversely. I'm trying to play the same trick with empire, leaning more on Constantin Fasalt in that regard, and his, I think, interesting but ultimately misleading remarks towards the end of the Limits of History, when he writes that, well, in the background there is always an empire, but that the empire is either a romantic thing or a pure fiction. Sources tell a different story. Empire might have always been a fiction, but since so many people for so long time have taken its existence seriously, I think we are compelled to take it seriously, however surreal or unreal empires might have been. But like international anarchy, like money, like any other construct, if it's sufficiently widespread and taken seriously by enough people simultaneously, it's a social fact in its own right, I would say. So thank you very much. I'm starting to feel a bit coarse in my throat. So
Thanks so much, Jens. It has been a privilege to hear you here today, and thanks for contributing to the IPS Brazil network and to talking to us today about your book. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in reading it, and many more discussions will go, will go ahead about the persistence of the empire of the international, right? And
yes,
especially now that barbarians are at the gates, right? So
yeah, they're everywhere. Yeah.
thanks so much, Jens. And I hope to see you in Brazil again soon. And thanks everyone for being here this morning. And I hope to see you in the future in our activities.
Thanks again, Joao, for inviting me. And thanks all who have been here patiently listening, and especially those who have asked very intelligent questions, which I go right into the next book. And the next book is on power.
Oh, okay.
Thank
Excellent. Look forward to that. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thanks so much, Jens. Thank you, João. Thank you all.
See you.
Thank you.